Great. So I think we can start. Well, welcome to the first online training of Move to CCAM. My name is Hector Cañas. I'm the project coordinator of Move to CCAM and also senior advisor at Babel Smart Cities. And together with me today, I have two amazing colleagues from Think's Insight and Strategy, our UK partner company in the project. And yes, I'm going to give the word to both Lucy and Celini to introduce themselves before starting today. So please go ahead, Lucy.
Thanks, Hector. Hi, everyone. I'm Lucy. I am a partner and managing director of the dialogue practice at Think's Insight and Strategy. My specialism is participation, participation in terms of public engagement, public dialogue, co-creation. I've worked across a range of sectors from transport to health. I'm also a fellow at the University of Lancaster, where I work on involving citizens in policy making. So this project has been a really great case study over a long period of time, a fascinating topic and a very broad geographical reach of exploring how participatory methods can contribute to transport planning. So that's me and my introduction. I'll hand over to Celini.
Thanks, Lucy. I'm Celini. I'm one of the researchers at Think's. I'm also an expert in qualitative research, including co-creation methods, and I've been working across a range of sectors as well. I've been involved in this project since the beginning, so I'm really excited to tell you more about how we apply co-creation in it and the different methods that we followed. Thank you.
Awesome. So before starting, I want to give a brief introduction to the project because I know that we have some couple of joiners that perhaps is the first time hearing about Move to CCAM. We are a project lasting for 34 months. We started in September 2022, so we're almost at the end. We have also a quite good, let's say, mix of partners, from technical partners, helping since in the development of the different methodologies used at Move to CCAM, and as well with our main deliverables. But as well, we have prototypical regions partners, which are basically three. Elodis representing the North Aegean islands from Greece, the region of Helmand, and the region of GZM in Poland. We're also having an external contributor helping us perhaps have this external perspective of self-driving vehicles, and this is the University of California, Santa Barbara. And basically, Move to CCAM has the main goal of developing an assessment method to evaluate the impact of integrating self-driving vehicles in European cities, right? And so by this, we mean to evaluate how different dimensions will be affected rather positively or negatively due to the self-driving vehicle. So we are exploring dimensions such as not just environment and economy, which are the, let's say, the dimensions that are more commonly evaluated, but as well on how land use will change in cities due to self-driving vehicles, as well the transport network, ethics within cities, security, safety, and so forth. We have a broad number of deliverables explaining how we have done this research. So I also invite you to go into our website to learn more about the project. Before starting with the agenda of the training, I would really like to know what are your expectations coming into this training? What are you expecting to learn and to take from co-creation in general? So please, I would ask you to join this Slido. You can either go into slido.com and then type in the code that you see there, or just with your phone, scan the QR code directly. Give a couple of minutes for you to write your answer. And as well, this Slido will remain active throughout the training, so you can as well keep writing your answers as long we go. Great. We will keep visiting your answers along the training, of course. So what do we have ahead of us today? Basically, we have developed and designed this training through 5 sections. We first want to introduce what is co-creation and its relevance for the future of self-driving vehicles, of course, from a perspective of research, right? Then we're passing into the life cycle approach we use at CCAM. For this, we will have Lucy explaining us the different steps that we have used in CCAM for co-creation, followed by an explanation on how to do recruitment for co-creation activities, specifically in transport research. Then we have a block explaining different approaches that can be used for co-creation in research. And finally, we have an example from a prototypical region, CCAM in Poland, from their experience in the different co-creation activities in the project. Before giving the word to Lucy, which will start by introducing co-creation, we want to know, what does co-creation mean to you? And please go into the poll again, and then just use one word, and we will build up a cloud of together, as we have here in it's the first word. Great, awesome. I think we will have a really nice word cloud after this training, and also we'll be happy to share this in our social media, just to show what all of us we were trying to. Great, so then now I give the word to Lucy for her to introduce you what is co-creation and its relevance. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Hector. And yeah, let me just check that I can now. Somebody just give me a thumbs up and let me know the slides are moving. Yes, perfect. All right, thank you very much. That is appreciated. All right, so I am going to do the warm up to this session. I'm going to talk a little bit about co-creation as a practice, co-creation as theory, co-creation as it's used across a wide range of sectors. I'm then going to talk about CCAM, or self-driving vehicles. We use those two terms interchangeably, so forgive us. We're referring there to the whole suite of self-driving, connected, autonomous transport systems, road-based transport systems. That's the bounds of the project that we're working in. Although I think you'll see as we go through that there's obviously applicability more broadly across our transport systems, across other kinds of socio-technical transitions. So what is co-creation? Let's start at the very beginning. Co-creation is a type of engagement that puts the end user at the heart of the design process. So we're interested here in design. That can be product design. It can be system design. It can be policy design. What we're talking about here is any kind of design process in which we are working towards implementing a defined endpoint. It's a process that empowers citizens, and where institutions commit to action increases uptake of products and services in the real world. There are two elements to that are important here. Firstly, the idea of empowering citizens. Co-creation is explicitly an approach that is concerned with power, and we'll talk about that a bit more. There's also the idea of being a commitment from institutions, and that's really crucial. One of the key risks of co-creation when it's done badly is that it can represent a kind of tokenism, a kind of sham consultation or engagement, which can actually unempower or disempower citizens. The ultimate goal, increasing uptake of products and services in the real world. I would go wider than that and say that actually it's not just about increasing uptake, but it's also about shaping that uptake and shaping that who is using services, who they are working for, how they're working well. The EU defines co-creation as the active involvement of citizens, citizen groups, civil society organisations and communities, and turning knowledge and research results to innovative solutions to help exploit market opportunities and inform policymaking. Co-creation is something of a buzzword across EU institutions currently, and we see it in a range of different sectors. But I think that at its heart, as I said, it's about power, but it's also about partnerships. It's about connecting actors and institutions that have typically interacted only in quite formalized and structured ways. If you think about planning, for example, about the ways in which we plan our cities, we plan our transport systems, we plan our infrastructure, there tended to be very formalized methods of engagement, very formalized fora for which citizens can interact with decision makers. Co-creation aims to move away from those very formalized structures to something much more collaborative. You may be familiar with this idea of the ladder of participation. Don't necessarily have to be a ladder. You can lie it on its side and call it a spectrum. But the idea is that there are some types of interactions between citizens and institutions which are more or less concerned with the transfer of power. At the top of our ladder, at the end of our spectrum, we have citizen control, delegated power and partnerships. That's where institutions and institutions can be very broad here. It can be governmental institutions. It can also cover any institution with power, with established power, whether that is the providers of a service, for example. They hold a particular type of power, economic power. So at the top of our ladder, we have types of engagement that give citizens or individuals greater control. At the bottom, we have therapy or manipulation are the terms that are often used to describe situations in which that power is consolidated and actually exerted over individuals by the institutions. And in the middle, we have what is sometimes negatively described as tokenism, but can actually just be appropriate. You know, there are plenty of settings in which what we want is a situation in which we're informing our citizens. But and so I think it's useful to think about this not necessarily as a ladder, but more as a spectrum. If we think about design on the left-hand side, we've got some examples here. If we think about what's the sort of least participatory version of design a thing, launch it, and then do some marketing to convince people that they wanted to buy it in the first place. That's your classic example of a kind of manipulative strategy. It's not necessarily ineffective. That's how much product design has been done for centuries. But if we move up through the ladder, we get through kind of product testing, market research, situations in which there is some interaction with end users. And at the top, we have this idea of designing with users from the start. And if we're thinking about product, services, or policy, that idea of designing with users from the start, it explains how we achieve both this shift of power, but also this very practical outcome of better design, which is something we're going to talk about a lot in the context of CCAM. So some key characteristics of co-creation. What is it that defines co-creation? It's a collaborative process where no one person or organisation is more important than the other. They might have different jobs to do, but there's a level playing field where within the co-creation activity itself, there's an assumption of parity or equity. It's a process which is concerned with diversity of experiences and expertise. We are more likely to have successful outcomes from co-creative processes when we have diverse groups of people in the room. And we'll talk a bit later on about how to understand that concept of diversity, what that means, and how we put it into practice. Co-creation is iterative. It's as is design and development of any kind of policy, system, process, product. So co-creation works best when it involves several cycles that allow for iteration and interaction. It encourages creativity, and the best methods for co-creation, as you might guess in the title, involve creativity. And that can be understood very broadly. It doesn't need to be about using pipe cleaners and glitter. It can just be about thinking openly about what types of conversations and how and where they can be facilitated. Co-creation gives citizens agency. Helps them to feel empowered, helps them to be empowered. It's important that citizens, that when we talk about this first point, when no person or organization is more important, we can't just assume that that happens simply by putting people in a room together. Citizens, in the context of interactions between citizens and institutions, citizens are starting from a different starting point. And we need to think about how we redress the existing inequalities, even if those are just inequalities of knowledge, for example, where institutions come with a set of embodied knowledge that is different from that of our citizens. So thinking about good co-creation is thinking about how do we give people a sense of agency. And lastly, it gives citizens a sense of responsibility. So there is a sense in which being involved in a co-creation process gives both the process itself should feel as empowering, but also that there's some outcome. When co-creation works really well, the participants all feel more connected to the output, whether that is a product or a service, whether it's geographically based, and there's a sense of connection to community, of interest, or of geography. So there's a range of ways in which co-creative processes are defined and which make them distinct. I'd like to hear a little bit from you here, and there aren't so many people in the room, so I think I might just suggest that if you would like to pop some comments in the chat, I'd like to hear what you think some of the potential risks of co-creation are. What you might have come into, what are the fears that you might have come into this session with? When we asked you what words you associated, there are many of the words that I used on the previous slide around collaboration, around partnership and synergy came up. It'd be interesting to know what, from your perspective, what are some of the examples of risks or concerns that you might have? I'll give people a minute if you would like to pop any thoughts in the chat, and we'll see if we agree on any of these. I mean, one of the risks of co-creation, of course, is that nobody contributes. So that's it can be difficult with an audience that you don't have a strong connection with to establish a norm of collaboration, of contribution. Brilliant. Some people have contributed. Not all co-creators are equal. That's a really interesting question. Yeah, comment. Yeah, this is true. Balance of power and information silos. Yes, absolutely. The differentials in power between individuals and institutions can be a real challenge in co-creation sessions. And the ways in which that power is not randomly distributed. Often power is distributed in ways that are replicative of existing inequalities in our societies. It can be as simple as we know, for example, that, and it's very well evidenced, that who is the first person to speak in a setting can influence the willingness of other people to speak. If a woman is asked the first question in a panel discussion, it is more likely that other women will speak up. It can be as simple as those kinds of inequalities, but also much more broadly in terms of the level of informational expertise. If you are talking about a topic like self-driving vehicles, which is relatively technical, actually those disparities of information can be a real challenge. People trying to convince as opposed to collaborate. Yes, absolutely. That sense that it can be really easy, particularly in emerging technology spaces, to see co-creation as a way to increase the acceptability of a predefined idea or product or service, rather than opening up to the possibility that quite a different service or product might emerge from a co-creation process. Divergent interests, I think, is a really interesting one. As I said, interests and power are not distributed randomly, and while we might be able to address them, those power inequalities in the room, we also need to think about the power inequalities that exist outside of co-creation systems. If we have a perfect co-creation process embedded in a totally non-collaborative environment, totally hierarchical top-down decision-making system, our co-creation process has little chance of having real impact. We need to think about what is the system in which it's embedded in. Brilliant, thank you for those. Coordination complexity, yes, we'll talk a little bit more about that later on, about just the challenge of making that happen. Some other risks that I had identified. Is there room for influence? Is there genuinely room for public influence on the product or service? Is this process genuine and authentic? This is a key challenge, and I think that we have responsibility as practitioners to understand where that is the case. Is the question too narrow? I think this is often defining the question is one of the most challenging aspects of setting up any co-creation process. Often the instigating or commissioning institution will have an idea about what that question is. Sometimes that question will be very, very specific. What should we do at this junction? How should this service work? What should this vehicle look like? When actually the questions that might feel relevant or pertinent to the public, to citizens, might be much broader. What is this place like? What is it like to live here? How does this contribute to my quality of life? And that mismatch of expectations around what is in scope and what is open can really restrict the ability to be creative and to problem solve. Budget and time constraints. I think it's important to recognise that often co-creation is perceived as expensive, but it is not as expensive as launching a product or service that has no market or use. It's also, I think, important to recognise that this is a question of prioritization, typically within our budgets. What is the priority that we assign to engagement? If we're not confident enough to put resources behind it, these processes are likely to fail when they're seen as add-ons or tokenistic. Recommendations not respected. As I said, this idea that there has to be some kind of preparatory work to make sure that institutions are ready to hear. Adhering to best practice. There are, processes that make co-creation that are learnt through hard experience about whether co-creation is working well. And that is important, but also it's important to understand the context. And lastly, a lack of accountability. I think one of the real challenges with co-creation processes and where they can struggle is when there's a sense that that there's not a kind of accountability, there's no follow through, there's not a sense that there's some oversight or legitimacy baked into the process. So that's a little bit about the sort of background of co-creation, some of the benefits and risks. My last section here, I'm just going to talk about why I think co-creation should be considered in the rollout of self-driving vehicles, why I think that's so important. And broadly, I think it's because self-driving vehicles have the potential to achieve real benefits. They have the potential to transform the ways in which our transport systems work, environmentally, in terms of the sustainability of our transport systems, accessibility and mobility for citizens, the ways in which our cities are designed and functioned, the economics of our transport systems. There are benefits that are widely stated, but they're not uncontested. We recently published some outcomes from this process where we find that actually there exists still really strong contention around whether people will use self-driving vehicles at all, and therefore to what extent these benefits will accrue. They're contextual. It's unrealistic to think that self-driving vehicles will have the same impact in every place, because the existing context is not the same, and they're very difficult to quantify. Quantifying future transport innovations is extremely challenging. So there are these potential benefits. They're uncertain, and they are contingent upon policy environments, upon the behavior of individuals, upon the context, and they're also affected by skepticism. So there's a challenge there which says that we might achieve these benefits, but not without conscious thought or without addressing the context. I find it useful. This is a framing, the thinking about self-driving vehicles as a socio-technical transition. So thinking them both about from the perspective of a technology that is evolving and developing, but also as having a societal impact. If we think about the ways in which transport innovations historically have changed our cities, we think about everything from the introduction of the motor car and the way that has changed the urban design of cities. We think about how that has happened differentially in Europe, in the US, in Asia, how the different cultural contexts have interacted with the capabilities of the technology to generate contextually specific outcomes. If we think about this self-driving vehicles as a socio-technological transition, who do we want to be directing that transition? And I think that co-creation, as an answer to that question, is we want everyone, or as wide a range of people as possible, to be involved in the direction of that transition. Why do we want that? because we know that if we don't involve a wide range of people in socio-technical transitions, we get bad outcomes. We get bike racks that are only accessible if you can pick a bicycle up above your head. That's limited to an extremely narrow range of users. That's an example of design that fails to consider users. We get unintended consequences. If we look at the development of e-bikes in the centre, and that there have been great advances in the way in which e-bikes and hire schemes have increased mobility for some groups of people, but there are also hugely unintended consequences of them. There are challenges when we think about design from too narrow a viewpoint. So in the top image here, we have the height of typical cars in the US relative to the height of a child. If you are concerned in your design with ensuring the security of the people and the safety of the people within the vehicle, which is an entirely reasonable conversation that you might have in a product design context, then what you design may well be less safe for other road users. A co-creation or co-design process in which you engage both the people using the service and the other users around you is more likely to generate a conversation about what safety means broadly to ensure those perspectives. And the classic example, if you only test vehicles on men, that doesn't work out so well for women. There are all kinds of ways in which co-creative processes that are inclusive and diverse and representative can lead to better outcomes. They might lead you to something that just is more useful. That's ultimately the thing that we're interested in co-creation, is distributing power in a design process, shifting towards a partnership model, but for a very explicit outcome, creating more useful, equitable and sustainable services and products. And that's the framing that we were interested in within the Move to CCAM project. It's not just how do we make people use self-driving vehicles. We want them to be used in ways that are sustainable, equitable, that are useful. If we go through this socio-technical transition to self-driving vehicles, and what we end up with is many more single-use, privately owned vehicles creating just as much congestion, just as much pollution on our roads, this is not necessarily a societally beneficial outcome. And we think that co-creation is one of the strategies to direct that transition in more positive ways. I've got just a couple more slides just to start to make this more practical before I hand over to Selene to talk about what we did in the Move to CCAM project. We talked about this idea of co-creation as a life cycle, as an iterative process. We start with recruitment at the top, with identifying the people that we need to involve. We work through ideation, and that's really, it can look very different in different projects, but broadly it's a process of open engagement on a question. A generative process. And then it's important that we move through a cycle of refinement. So this is not about generating a citizen wish list. It's about having a realistic conversation about how ideas may be implemented, what the challenges might be, bringing in expertise from different sectors, different practices, different disciplines to understand what a solution might be that meets as many of the different needs of users as possible. Piloting and prototyping, development and testing, those are key stages at which we want to see co-creation moving into a process where we don't just have the idea, but we also figure out why the first idea doesn't work, because it probably doesn't. And if we stop our co-creation process there, then we don't benefit from the insight of those crowds that we've collected through our recruitment. And lastly, really good co-creation carries on through implementation and evaluation. That sense of responsibility, of ownership, of connection between individuals and the product or service or policy that they've contributed to, that can continue through that evaluation process. And we'll show how we've kind of implemented that cycle through the Move to CCAM project. I'm going to talk a little bit about who should be involved and how we think about this idea of diversity. And what citizens and what organisations. I think it's useful to reflect on why the difference between representation or representativeness and inclusion. We often hear the word representative, a representative sample. It's the gold standard of statistical quantitative research. It may not be a very useful concept in co-creation, where replicating the existing society perfectly may not be very helpful. Not least because when we think about all of the criteria that are relevant to transport use, some of those people will be represented in very small numbers in your sample. What's more useful, we think, is to think about inclusion. How can you ensure that a wide range of perspectives are meaningfully understood within the co-creation process? So not just having one person trying to represent the perspectives of a whole group of people, but meaningfully engaging with that group of people in depth. And my last kind of example of this is a stakeholder map, which I use all the time. It's old, but it's from some work around forestry. And I just think it's a really useful way of thinking about who might you want to involve in your co-creation process. So if you think about a forest, a physical place, and you want to do some engagement around how that forest is used, you might start by thinking about who is geographically close to it. You've got your neighbours, your landowners, your local community. That's one way of thinking about who do we want to involve. You might think about then other types of relationships. So other professional relationships between people, organisations, institutions and the forest. People who have an economic connection to it. People who have a part of a community of interest, which is of concern. These people may not be geographically connected to this place, but they are stakeholders to it. Economic interests might be more diverse again as you start to think about what are the different ways in which people use this place. They might even start to be in conflict as you think, for example, about people who are using the economic resources in different ways. There may also be people who use your forest in ways that you don't want them to. Thinking about that example earlier, I said about when design goes wrong, thinking about the ways in which unexpected consequences of e-bike rentals. Thinking about who are the stakeholders and people who are really using a place, a service, a product, a policy is really important and can help you to understand some of those unintended consequences better. And those are people who are typically not going to be engaged in a co-creation process. And lastly, thinking about potential users. So who is not currently there? If we only engage the people who currently use our transport systems in their development and not the people who are currently excluded from access to our transport systems, then we will replicate the same inequalities that we currently see. So thinking more broadly about who's not currently there can again help those co-creation processes to become much more constructive, much more inclusive, and to achieve more equitable outcomes in terms of design. All right, I think, Hector, you're going to keep time. So are you happy for us to just have a few minutes in case there are any questions on this section before we start talking about the Move to CCAM project in detail?
Yeah, currently we don't have a question in the chat, but we can give 1 minute perhaps for people to write down their questions and also that you can address them right now. So please, if you have any questions from the content Lucy presented, go ahead and write it in the chat. Yeah. Otherwise, we will also give space at the end for us to have a more broad discussion on your questions. So in any case, keep writing your questions in the chat and then we'll address them at the end. Thank you. Okay, can go ahead, Celini.
Brilliant. Thank you. And thank you, Lucy. Yes, perfect. So in this section, I'm just going to talk you through specifically how we applied co-creation in the context of the Move to CCAM project. So Hector mentioned earlier a little bit about what this project was all about when we set out in 2022. Essentially, what we wanted to do is to explore views of self-driving vehicles from the perspective of different citizens and organizations. And to do this, what we did was involved citizens and organizations from across 8 countries in the European region. And what we wanted to do is, through their active participation, working towards building a tool that would estimate the potential impacts of self-driving vehicles in different areas. And through that, we wanted to be able to share recommendations about what to do, how to do it, any challenges and opportunities within the findings from our research by the end of this project, which is very near now. Lucy mentioned earlier what is the life cycle of co-creation, and that starts, as she said, by recruitment. She talked a lot about the concept of inclusion, and what we wanted to do with this project is make sure we include a diverse set of citizens from all the participating countries in our research. So we started by thinking about age and life stage. We really wanted to make sure we included participants who might be traveling with young children, might be actively commuting to city centres on a very frequent basis, or might be having mobility aids such as walking sticks when they're commuting or traveling. We also wanted to think about gender because, as Lucy mentioned, this is really important to take into consideration. We know that when it comes to self-driving vehicles, there's research showing that there are different attitudes towards safety, particularly when there's absence of any onboard staff. We also wanted to take into account health conditions, taking into consideration people with disability and also people who might have long-term health conditions who might be impacting their mobility. Location was also a key consideration. We wanted to make sure that we don't just include urban and suburban locations. We actively included very rural locations such as the North Aegean region and people actually living in small villages within the region to ensure that they're all included in the project, as well as driving capacity, making sure that we're not just considering people who have driving licenses and are able to drive, but also people who are not actively able to drive or don't know how to drive. Finally, we took into consideration socioeconomic context as well, making sure that we also included people with financial constraints, as well as people who might be more likely to depend on a wide range of mobility modes. In terms of the organizations that we included, as Lucy mentioned, it's really important to have expert knowledge in the design of our project. And what we wanted to do here was make sure that we had a wide range of organizations offering their views throughout our co-creation process. Therefore, what we did was include a very sort of wide range, as you can see, from health experts to passenger transport operators, CCAM developers and manufacturers, NGOs, research organizations, as well as local authorities and regulatory bodies. It was essential for us to involve them right from the beginning to make sure that they could help citizens understand what is and is not feasible, any areas of uncertainty and challenge that could come up. Also help us map the landscape for the self-driving vehicles to be deployed and ensure as well that the environment is appropriate for the deployment of such vehicles and services. We then moved forward with ideation and refinement. As part of this project, what we did was present and co-create together with our citizens and organizations a range of case studies, of use cases of different vehicles, self-driving vehicles that could be implemented in the future in their areas. Those included delivery bots, self-driving taxis, private cars, buses. You can see here a rural autonomous shuttle bus again as well. So all of those use cases had specific characteristics that were co-created together with the participants. And what we wanted to do through a series of co-creative sessions and activities was to encourage participants to think about how they personally use transport in their daily lives. What are the transport needs of themselves as well as other people in their communities, as well as develop a citizen perspective to take into consideration the more holistic needs of a particular community as a whole. All of those were taken into account as part of the co-creation stage of ideation and refinement. We then moved forward with the prototyping stage. And as part of this, what we wanted to do was, together with our participants, understand what are the potential impacts for each use case, so for each self-driving vehicle and service that we discussed. And within that, we wanted to explore the potential impacts across different areas, such as the environment, the economy, equity, safety, mobility, network efficiency, land use, as well as human health. So we got them to really think about those impacts, what could happen in their local area if that particular service was deployed, and what is the correlation between impacts that could lead to potentially uptake of self-driving vehicles in the future, as well as challenges or concerns about the use of those vehicles. Finally, throughout all of this co-creation, all of those co-creation stages and all of those different sort of conversations with our participants, we were able to build a beta version of our IMT tool, the tool that we want to ensure that it helps regional planners assess the potential impacts of self-driving vehicles and services in their area. So we took into account all of the findings and ideas that both organizations and citizens co-created together throughout our sessions to build the tool and ensure that all of the elements that the tool is taking into account is not just build it on research and existing findings that we have, but actual ideas that came out of our sessions. You can see here one of the workshops that took place in Helmond, the Netherlands, one of the participating regions in our research project. And it was really helpful for stakeholders to be able to see how their input has been implemented in the development of the IMT tool. We then presented the tool, the beta version of the tool, to those participating organizations in order to get their feedback, also get ideas about how it could be further refined, further optimized, how it could be potentially used by them, and any areas of improvement or uncertainty that they were able to identify. And then finally, after all of those refinements have been implemented, a fully functional version of the tool is accessible through the IMT website. So organizations and stakeholders are able to access the tool and assess any potential impacts of different self-driving vehicles and services in the areas of their interest, in order to be able to take it into account for their planning and decision making. Great. I just wanted to pause here before I hand over to Hector to talk about different co-creation approaches that are applicable to research when it comes to self-driving vehicles. But yes, I just wanted to see if there are any questions at all about how we applied co-creation in the context of the Move to CCAM project. Just giving a couple minutes here.
Delaney, while we're waiting for those questions, I think one of the things that is interesting about the way in which we applied co-creation in this project is that it's actually, it's relatively unusual to apply co-creation at the scale, at the breadth that we did, so looking across so many countries. And that did influence the selection of methods and the approaches. I know Hector is going to talk in more detail about some of the different ways in which we can deploy different co-creation methods. And I think what's interesting is that we that one of the challenges was to build the sense of connection or community within this group of people on what was very geographically distributed, but also we weren't in this case designing a specific service that would be implemented in a place. We were designing the infrastructure for this socio-technical transition. And that sense of so actually thinking about what is part of the motivation for taking part in a co-creation process is that sense of seeing the output. For us, the output is relatively abstract. It's a transport planning tool, and that did sort of inform the ways in which we engaged people, and to some extent also I think probably did influence the people who stayed involved in this project and who stayed involved through the 34 months of the project, relative to something with a more immediate or direct connection to individuals.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it was a very complex topic anyways to begin with, for many of those regions and participants that took part. I can see some questions in the chat.
Yeah. Questions, yeah.
Yeah.
Rebecca Posner is asking, did you find any cultural differences between countries, and how did you manage that across your project?
That is a really good question, actually. I would say yes, that there were definitely some differences. I think the key difference that I was able to identify by visiting some of those participating regions was there was just a different level of understanding when it came to self-driving vehicles, and also a different level of whether participants believe that this could be applicable to the region, right? If we were talking about a very urban location and a very urban country and city such as the UK, the realities of that will be very different to what we encountered in North Aegean, for instance, in Greece, where it was really hard for participants to understand the concept of self-driving vehicles in context and in the context of the region, and it was really hard for them to envisage a future where those services would be deployed. So we had to really help them envisage this, and also manage some realities that, for instance, they won't be implemented in the next 20 years necessarily in the region. It might take a lot longer for them to see actually such self-driving vehicles and services operating in mass in the region. That was a reality that we had to accept. And we had to accept that there are differences between locations based on the infrastructure and capabilities that are in place.
There are also some really practical differences just in terms of how public engagement is understood. So some of the things that just somebody asked about kind of project coordination, just that the differences in how you compensate people for their time. When you're talking about everyday members of the public, how do you ensure that they are so if you ask people just to volunteer for this type of work and you don't account for their time, you're going to end up with a very skewed set of people. So we wanted to be able to compensate people for their time. Culturally, that's very different in different places. In the UK, it's a fairly well-established concept that you can pay research participants for their time directly. In the Netherlands, for example, that was absolutely not something that a public authority could do, and there were some practical differences there in terms of how the sessions ran and the natures of the discussions and the ways in which people contributed to them. Very different between the Netherlands, between GSZM, between some of the North Aegean groups. So I do think actually it's one of the things that we haven't sort of had the chance to follow up with yet, but understanding how those cultural norms around what participation looks like, what sort of these types of more deliberative conversations look like, generate different results, I think is one of the things that's interesting. And for us as researchers trying to achieve a degree of consistency, one of the things we learned through the project actually was that we needed to let go of that a little bit and to set a kind of have some clear, consistent points that we wanted. You know, we wanted to get to the same outcomes from each activity, but being much more comfortable with local, with that being interpreted and implemented in slightly different ways locally. I think was an important learning from the project. And I don't think that took away from the quality of the data, for example, which was, but when, you know, we just had to sort of figure out a way to get the same data, allowing for that variation.
Exactly. I see one question more from Anna, but I think the answer is to come in my section. So I'll just go ahead and proceed. And also, please continue writing your questions. What also we want to encourage you all is for us to have a quite good exchange from this training. So please, whichever your question is, I think it will provide quite good value to the discussion we want to have. Great. So in general, as a first step before deciding which co-creation activity is the most suitable, which, by the way, that I think this is like the main question when starting such projects is which is the best engagement activity for us, and for this, basically, one must know what goal do you want to achieve with this engagement activity. What output do I want to take from the activity? And so usually in EU-funded research projects, we're driving the research through the technologies readiness level. This TRL level is what we want our pilots or demonstrations to reach, right? So then within the 3 areas of the TRL level, we have here in the research phase, the development phase, and the deployment phase. So then one thing that we need to think about when selecting the co-creation activity is which goal are we trying to aim from the different, let's say, phases of our research, right? So then at first, if our project is more involved into the research phase of the TRL, then we might have goals such as idea generation, policy strategy or development, or even product development. If our project is more into developing, let's say, a certain pilot or product, then our outputs could be more on the strategy development, product development, or testing. And then finally, if our project is aiming for more maturity, and therefore our phase could be more into the deployment, then the goal could be just into testing or validating. And so alongside this goal of the co-creation activity, another decision-making factor for selecting our co-creation activities is basically what Celini was telling us about, which stakeholder to bring into the co-creation activities. And so if we are to address citizens into our engagement activities, there's a different range of approaches that can be used depending on the different goals that we are trying to aim in the activity. So one of, since there are several, one of the ones that I'm perhaps more keen on is, for instance, if we would just want to spark ideas for our research, we could organize urban workshops. I have a dedicated slide to explain you what is this approach about. So I will show you more what it is about. But for instance, if we want to test or validate a specific product, then we could develop a virtual reality experience, so like an immersive experience together with citizens to actually have them experience this new form of service or a new product. As well, we could have experts or industry stakeholders participate in our engagement activities. And we have approaches such as hackathons, innovation challenges, also to spark ideas and new ways of doing things. But also we could have, if we are more into product development as a goal, we could have focus group, co-creation arenas to actually co-build these products. And finally, we have policymakers as well as key stakeholders in engagement activities. And also there are specific type of approaches that can be applied with them. These, of course, are more into, let's say, ranging from consultations, dialogues, and making them participants of advisory groups within our project. Finally, regarding the co-creation approaches, I want to hear from you which co-creation approaches have you used in the past. So please just go ahead into the chat and you could write some of the approaches that you have used in your projects right there. You could also show us what, for instance, has been used in the past or currently in research. So I have selected 3 examples of approaches to explain in this training. The first one is the backcasting workshop that we used in Move to CCAM. This relates specifically to activity 5, in which we were trying to define which were the impacts that self-driving vehicles would cause in the future. So basically, backcasting was the right approach to be used, because backcasting is a method to reflect the consequences of the future due to present choices, right? So it's basically saying, if we do X today, then Y will happen in the future. And so if you remember the map that Celini showed you, in which we were showing different post-its, here we developed one of these maps for each use cases that were co-created at the beginning. And so the trigger action for starting this reflection of future consequences was to make citizens imagine that e-hailing would be already rolled out in their cities. So basically, e-hailing, for those of you who perhaps don't know, is like Uber, right? But then with autonomous vehicles. Already we have Waymo in the United States already operating. So basically, this is what we tried citizens to try to imagine. And so we had 8 impact dimensions to be then evaluated. But for instance, in the impact dimension of mobility, citizens were able to basically reflect that if we would have e-hailing with autonomous vehicles, this will yield to more trips, right? So that there will be less, let's say, idle times of the service, because there's no driver in the vehicle that would need to rest, let's say. And so more trips would be a consequence. But then this could also yield to more congestions, as then there will be more cars in roads. Regarding land use as well, one prompt was that less parking spaces would be needed, as then these cars could be operating more time and therefore be less time parked. And then this could yield to have more dense neighborhoods, as then less parking space would be needed. But then this could also yield to have an increase of population density. So then through backcasting, we were able to construct a lot of these future consequences that then were super useful for us to then define how then these different dimensions would be impacted. And then it was quite easy then to model our tool to then consider different aspects in the assessment. Then we have the project Sunrise. Basically, Sunrise project is already a finished project from Horizon 2020. This is sustainable urban neighborhoods research and implementation support in Europe. Basically, in this project, they use the urban workshops, the one that I mentioned before. And the urban workshops, basically, its aim is to steer a group of citizens, or could be stakeholders, industry experts, into a specific urban space to identify issues, potential, let's say, opportunities, and also feelings or reactions from the stakeholders in real time. And so the urban workshops are organized tours by an expert that can moderate let's say, what all of the stakeholders are seeing from that space, in order to then retrieve their their feedback, right? So they can use maps as well, digital tools to pinpoint the different feedbacks from the citizens and stakeholders in the different areas, and therefore have let's say tangible reactions from the space. As well, we have hackathons. Hackathons were also used in the show project, which is a project that, as well as Move to CCAM, is focusing on self-driving vehicles. And hackathons basically are time-bound events where stakeholders collaborate to develop innovative solutions, addressing specific challenges. And this is a more interactive way of co-creating, since there's a competition put in place so that different experts can provide these solutions to the project. In the case of the show project in Thessaloniki, the challenge was to conceive innovative solutions to increase user acceptance, focusing on 3 problems: human assistance, standby in case of problems, adapting capacity to handle demand, and accessibility and assistance for persons with reduced mobility. So there are different things to consider when selecting these 3 types of approaches. For instance, hackathons are quite good when rapid ideation or prototyping is needed. Some advantages is that then there's are tangible outcomes from the co-creation activity that can then be integrated into the project. But then the disadvantage is that this might leave out vulnerable groups, since some level of expertise are needed to then participate in these activities. Urban workshops, for instance, is useful when interventions are tied to a specific location. Some disadvantages is that these are limited to smaller areas. You cannot bring stakeholders to do a super long tour, right? So it needs to be focalized. And thirdly, with backcasting, it's useful when a strategic pathway roadmap must be defined. Some advantages is this system thinking, and focuses on desired futures, not just the present problems, right? It inspires brainstorming for the stakeholders. Great. So then I told you I had brought with me some case study from the experiences of a prototypical region in these co-creation activities. And for this, I have asked Adriana Witkowska to provide us some inputs from her experience as the lead of the prototypical region of GZM in the project. And basically, the 3 prototypical regions launch several co-creation activities ranging from use case co-creation, business model co-creation, then doing engagement activities such as the VR demonstration and testing of the AMT tool. But then some of the insights she provided us was that regarding the challenges, she felt that there was low level of engagement of participants that we had recruited, right? So that they weren't, let's say, organically drawn to the project. And so some of the learnings she mentioned is that one needs to adapt the level of involvement of these specific participants over time, so that then maybe they start with less responsibilities and then increase them until needed more of the engagement from them. As well, another challenge is to balance these group dynamics, specifically when having different type of stakeholders in the activities. And so as well, the let's say flexibility of or level of adaptation of the activities must be set in order to build this knowledge with the different activities that we're launching in the project, so that then at the end we can reach this deeper engagement that we're looking for. Regarding the results, we identified that with that high impact was achieved with these immersive activities. And so if you're able to develop activities that are more tangible for your participants, then it is expected to achieve more impact. So not only with VR, for instance, but also, as I mentioned, the urban workshops could be some activity that could yield to high impact. And finally, is as well the complexity that we bring into the activities, specifically with terminology or with the exercises that we have. We need to adapt this specifically in the early stages when our participants are new to the project. And this needs to be done so that then there's a smooth transition into the activities. Here's a small picture from activity 5 in Poland and defining the qualitative impact assessment. Great. We also have another slot for Q&A. We have some questions from Judith. How and when did you give feedback to any citizen or entity participating in each country? I think you referred to feedback from the activity's results. Yeah, one of the things that we felt it was good from the Move to CCAM co-creation activities is that we tried to maintain the same group of participants along the activities. And so one of the first things we did when passing to the next activity was to do a reflection of the previous one. Or if we had also newcomers into the activities, try to catch them up with what was done previously. So this was a way in which we tried to provide this feedback. So trying to then maintain the same group of participants. You have also some additional comments, Lucy or Cellini also.
That was exactly what we did, Hector. Thank you. I saw another question about whether we replicated each activity described at each country involved. Yes and no, I think, is the answer to that. We adapted some of the activities to some countries. So we had 3 countries that we identified as the prototypical regions on this project. That was Poland, Greece, and the Netherlands. So in those countries, we ensured that we had in-person sessions. So we invited participants to come into venues, and we co-created in face-to-face workshop sessions. In the other countries, we did online activities. Those were a mix of online workshops as well as online activities using research platforms such as Recollective. Those are platforms where we can get participants to engage with us in an interactive way, take part in different tasks and activities at their own time. So we used a combination of both in the remaining countries. It's also important to say that towards the end of the project, because of time constraints, we focus mainly for the last sort of stages of the co-creation, and we focus mainly on the prototypical regions. So we sort of emphasized workshops taking part in those areas rather than the remaining countries participating in our project.
Good. And as matters of a wrap up, we have 4 main learning outcomes that we can share. The first is that co-creation is this method of distributing power, as Lucy mentioned in the design process. We want to shift this from, let's say, the internal group of researchers or partners in the project to the stakeholders that then will benefit from the outcomes of the project. Also, that co-creation is not suitable for all projects, and then it is on us to then assess which approach is a good fit or if we need co-creation at all. Then Salini and also Lucy mentioned the 6 steps towards co-creation, specifically those that we applied into CCAM from recruitment until testing and implementation. And finally, from my section, if you are to choose a co-creation activity, you can base it through 2 main points. Which goal do we want to achieve? And as well, which people do we want to be inviting to this recreation activities. Great. This is what we had brought for you today. We still have time, but then this time we want to dedicate to hear you out. We want to have as well more discussions regarding perhaps what you are applying in your organizations. If you have had some experiences with co-creation in the past. So also you can unmute yourself and speak out. It's not also necessary to write it in the chat.
It was just sharing in the chat, Hector. There's a very recently published paper which summarizes some of the findings of the project in terms of the perceptions of citizens across the countries that we worked in, which is interesting. One of the questions earlier was about kind of cultural differences. And I think what we found, interestingly, while there was quite a considerable variation, as Salini described, in terms of how people imagined these vehicles operating in their specific locales. So as you can imagine, the benefits in the Greek islands of a network of road vehicles was less apparent than in a city. On the other hand, when we look across the perceptions of citizens, when we ask them what do they imagine that these sorts of vehicles will look like, what we find was a really actually strikingly consistent kind of shared view of what self-driving vehicles will do and will look like in the future. Actually really consistent around them being electrified, shared mobility featured really heavily when we asked people to move into this more projective space of imagining what they're like, rather than asking what would you use personally. So kind of juxtaposing the sort of shared stated preference type work that asks what would you do in a given circumstance, and asking people much more broadly what sorts of things do you want to see. Then we get this sense of people perceiving this very much this kind of shared public transport role for vehicles, much more so than private vehicles, which was maybe a little surprising. We hadn't necessarily expected to see that. We see some kind of indicative differences in the ways that people from more rural or urban environments imagine different transport modes, different demographic groups. There's some interesting kind of suggestions in that. Obviously, this work isn't designed to be representative or to allow us to generalize across different demographic groups, but there are some interesting nods in that data to this sort of this like replication of existing transport use patterns. So, for example, we see more women than men talk about self-driving buses, which replicates the fact that there's a fairly consistent tendency across Europe for buses to be used more by women, by people on lower incomes relative to private cars, which is more used by. So there are some indications in there around the ways in which people sort of have this shared vision of a future that look quite different, but also that is to some extent mitigated or moderated by the existing norms within which they operate. And I think that's then one of the things that's really interesting about working in this co-creative way, which is that that we then had the opportunity through the rest of the project to explore what does that look like in detail? What does that look like in place? What does that look like for land use, for mobility, for all of those different aspects that Hector presented? So yeah, that you're very welcome to. That's basically just an advert for this paper, which I hope might be useful to some people.
Exactly. We have a hand from raised from Brian. So go ahead, Brian, and unmute yourself.
Okay. Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Okay,
Yes.
great. So I just wanted to find out about your experience with the recruitment and the knowledge gap. I mean, if you, I'm not sure how exactly you do it, but I can imagine a random process. You can end up with people who know practically, nothing about a specialist area like self-driving cars. And I'm just wondering how you then facilitate their effective participation to the extent that as facilitators, you have access to experts and, all the technical information readily digested and explained to you. But if you're recruiting randomly, you end up with people who don't even have access to that kind of backup, and there's a wide knowledge gap, and the participation may be illusory as a result. But I just want to find out, how do you then, bridge that sort of gap in your experiences? How have you done it to ensure their effective participation? Thanks.
Interesting question, I will say. Yes, we did recruit randomly. And what we did was, for the purposes of this project, develop what we call a recruitment questionnaire. So a set of questions that were aimed to be used at recruitment interviews with people who would take part in our research, to make sure that they fulfill the criteria that we set out as part of this project. The criteria were the ones that I mentioned around, our gender, life stage, mobility issues, healthcare issues, anything that could be impacting their mobility, attitudes, but also their needs. So what we did was develop that recruitment questionnaire, translate it for all of the participating countries. And then in most cases, we use recruitment agencies, so companies that go out, use the recruitment questionnaire, and essentially interview potential participants to see if they meet our criteria. Those people have nothing to do with the concept of self-driving vehicles, so they had no prior knowledge necessarily of them. Some of them might have heard them. Some of them could have varying knowledge or awareness, but that was not part of our recruitment criteria. We just wanted to ensure that we had a very diverse set of citizens taking part in this. In terms of how we helped sort of bridge that gap, was by basically presenting them with some information to help them understand what we mean by self-driving vehicles in our session. So I remember, if I remember correctly, in one of the first workshops, what we did was we showed them a video of a self-driving car, showing how that could operate in a city, how it would work without a driver, what kind of decisions it made, how it avoided certain accidents on the road. And we kind of provided some background information as part of our sort of opening presentation to them, telling them a bit about what we mean by self-driving vehicles, what types of vehicles we include as part of this project. So for the purposes of the Move to CCAM project, for instance, we didn't include any vehicles, self-driving vehicles that would operate in the sea or the air, such as airplanes. We only had drones as part of the air self-driving vehicles. So we kind of set a framework in terms of what we're looking to explore and some background information without actually overwhelming them, because we wanted to also see how they understood that, and what kind of views they had after we presented them with that kind of information.
I suppose the other thing, just to add on that, if I may, Talini, is that one of the things that I think is useful is to differentiate between the different types of knowledge that people bring to a conversation like this. So while citizens may not have technical knowledge of how self-driving technology is developed, or what they do have is embodied knowledge of transport systems and the way in which they operate in their cities, in their locations. And so one of the things that we try to do through co-creative processes, actually I mentioned this at the beginning, this idea that just because you get a group of people in the room doesn't mean that you've magically, created an equitable participation space. Part of how you do that is to think about the different types of knowledge and to think about how you can disrupt the kind of the privileging of technical or institutional knowledge that is often kind of exists in our wider society. So in really practical terms, we started by asking people about how they travel. You start by asking people about the thing that they're expert in, which is their experience. It's their experience of the place that they live, the ways in which they travel, the challenges with that, how they want that to look. And by sort of starting with that and centering that knowledge that they have, which is embodied in place and in practice and in lived experience, you then create a sort of a sense for them individually that they do have an expertise that is relevant and valued, but also in that interaction with the technical expertise, you create a sense of there being these kind of balanced positions of power, positions of authority, which are not just based on sapient authority, but are also based on like embodied authority. And that's just really, really important. And we kept that all the way through. We tried to keep bringing people back to the place that they live and what it's like. Which I do think is one of the things that differentiates this type of co-creative approach and differentiates the sorts of things that you can find out from it relative to some more maybe abstracted kind of survey work, which tends to rely on applying a much more, in order to get a kind of effective and consistent set of data, you're usually trying to sort of create scenarios that everybody can get on board with rather than just embracing the kind of slightly messy and individual nature of data that you get from co-creation. Sorry, that's the thing that I'm interested like that. That's one of my pet interests.
Exactly. And just a quick one before jumping into Rebecca's question. Another way was that we had to really redefine the terminology in all of our activities. So it was interesting because we started with the first deliverables of the project, and of course, because most of all of our partners, we are quite engaged in the topic of CCAM. We just then, when we started designing all of the co-creation activity material, we saw that the terms and the language we were using were completely oriented to technical stakeholders. And so we had to redefine how we were communicating to citizens, for instance, that perhaps would be the first time hearing about this type of projects. Good. So Rebecca is asking, what were some of the key lessons you took away to ensure you could meet the varying accessibility requirements to allow for in-depth engagement across such a diverse sample? Oh, that's also a really good question. Who wants to bat at it first?
Lucy, you're on mute. I don't know if you said something about this.
I did. I tried to make you answer it. Sorry. I just wondered if there's anything practically thinking about the sessions that you took away from it.
In terms of the accessibility needs, I think what we made sure was that all of the venues were indeed accessible. And also what we did was include the carers of any people with mobility issues that took part in our research, which was really helpful. For those who weren't able to join the sessions for varying reasons, they were actually represented by their carers who actually offered the care perspective, obviously, in terms of the needs, also able to relay some of the daily challenges that some of the people with healthcare issues or mobility issues were facing in their daily lives. So that's one of the things that we did to ensure that they were also represented.
I also think the mix of in-person and online sessions is important. I think there's often a sort of, we default when we're thinking about accessibility to an assumption that well, there's a sort of debate about whether online is more accessible. I think having a mix is really important because actually in terms of this work, one of the hardest to reach groups is young professionals, young families, people who are in full-time employment, who maybe have additional caring responsibilities outside of that and just lack the time to take part in something like this. For those people, the kind of trade-off of taking part, the time is something that's limited. And so running online sessions that were relatively short for them is more accessible. So we tried to do that, tried to kind of think about what are the different formats in which we can best reach different groups, and when is it really important to bring them together and to use that kind of relatively limited time actually that we had. Even on a project of this scale, the actual physical time that we could get in the room with people is limited. So using that really wisely.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think linked to that, Lucy, was the fact that we did online both sort of workshops that required presence in front of a laptop, but also activities that people could complete at their own time. So that could actually cater to those who might not be available during working hours or in the afternoons and might be quite busy. But also with the face-to-face sessions, some of those living in locations where the Wi-Fi connection is not great, might not necessarily have really good knowledge of technology, were also able to take part through the face-to-face session. So thinking about the North Aegean region and some of the older participants that we had there, I remember some of them saying that it would be really hard for them to take part in anything online due to their confidence, but also access to good Wi-Fi networks.
Exactly.
Sorry, Hector.
No, totally agree with you. And another method that we applied was, and I think this is a straightforward solution, is that we held all of these activities in native language of the place where we were doing the co-creation activities. And we really wanted to invest in this within the project, right? Because of course there's a lot of time put in place to do the translations back and forth, right? Because you first create the training material in English. When you are working in the project, then you need to translate it for the actual activity, and then you receive the results in the native language that then needs to be translated back to English. But then I think that's a quite valuable investment to do to ensure accessibility. Maybe another one that comes to mind is that I believe like all of us that we were moderating those co-creation activities also had this sense of support to participate, right? So then when you are in the ground with the different participants, you are also recognizing these potential barriers to engagement, right? And then you're trying to moderate and support people then to just participate in the activities, right? So then also the feeling and mood, and then the readiness of the moderator needs to consider that there might be some barriers for participation in the groups. We have another question. So you talked about different kinds of autonomous vehicles you consider to think about during the activities, but did you let them to try them as we did in this project in Catalunya? Yeah, question from Judy.
I mean, yes, we did. It's not part of this co-creation training that we're running today, but yes, we did some demonstrations in Helmond and Poland as well. So in Helmond, Netherlands, and Poland, just the 10. So yes, it was, I think, quite interesting for people to actually try them. We also did some virtual reality experiments in both of those locations, as well as the North Aegean. And again, it was really interesting to see how people reacted to those. So we developed some specific scenarios of virtual reality games and got people to interact with them using some headsets. So yeah, those were really interesting. But actually, we're going to be talking more about those in another training that will be tied in with this one. It's going to be an in-person training in London, and we will share more information, I think, after this meeting. So if anyone is in London and interested in joining and hearing more about those demonstrations and experiments, we can share a bit more information.
Good. Then just again, thanking Lucy and Celini for joining us as experts in this training. And of course, to all of you for taking your time in this Wednesday to learn a bit more about our project. We will still be in touch with you. As we mentioned, we have a series of trainings happening in May and June that will be announced in our social media. So if you're not following us yet, please do. We are in LinkedIn as Move to CCAM project, and as well our website that was shared here in the chat with our deliverables if you want to read more about the work we have done, and as well the nice paper that Lucy shared with you that is also coming from results of our activities. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you all very
Thank
much
you.
for attending. Much
Thank you
appreciated.
all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.